I never thought a routine checkup would change the entire course of my life. The doctor didn't smile, didn't ask how I was feeling. He just placed his hand on the file in front of him and looked me straight in the eye. "You have lymphoma," he said, voice flat, like he was announcing a delayed flight. I didn't respond, not because I was too shocked, but because I knew that if I let my emotions break the surface in that moment, I wouldn't have the strength to walk out of that office. I worked at Harris Coal Logistics, an international freight company headquartered in Milwaukee. I'd been there for nearly 2 decades. I didn't have a college degree, no fancy title, and my desk was wedged between the accounting floor and the break room. But there was one thing that made me invaluable. I was the only person in the entire company who knew sign language fluent, not just fingerspelling. And because of that, I was a sole bridge between our firm and Kazuo Takeda, the CEO of Takeda Freight Group, our largest and most demanding international client based out of Osaka. Mr. Takeda had been deaf since childhood. Brilliant, exacting, and fiercely private, he didn't work with outside interpreters. He only signed contracts in the presence of someone he trusted. For 17 years, that person had been me. After my diagnosis, I didn't take a leave of absence. I still showed up every morning, sometimes with trembling knees from chemo, but always prepared. I didn't tell anyone about the cancer. I didn't want sympathy. I just wanted to keep doing my job quietly, reliably, loyally, like I always had. But something had shifted. I could see it in how people stopped meeting my eyes in the hallway, in the meetings I was suddenly no longer invited to. And then came Ethan Khalif, fresh-faced heir to the company legacy, Harvard MBA, a resume built for shareholders. He barely knew my name, but I saw it in his posture. He was here to clean house. I didn't know what exactly they had planned, but I could feel it coming, the subtle erasure, the polite replacement. To them, I was a relic, a good soldier past his prime. And I was right. I just didn't expect them to move so faster, to be so foolish. The following Monday, something in the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the pressure before a storm, except it wasn't the weather or the old heating system creaking to life. It was the kind of silence that lingers after change has quietly slipped into the building and made itself comfortable in a corner office. That morning, the company-wide email arrived without warning, announcing our new CEO, Mr. Ethan Cole. I stared at the subject line for a moment before opening it, though I already knew what it would say. Ethan was young, sharp, polished, the kind of executive who walked into a room and saw balance sheets before faces. His credentials were a masterclass in ambition. Harvard Business School, former strategy consultant for a firm that charged 6 figures just to suggest what kind of coffee to serve in boardrooms, and a resume littered with titles like Regional Growth Director and Transformation Architect. He didn't inherit the company. He acquired it piece by piece, nameplate by nameplate, until Harris Coal no longer felt like the place where I'd built a quiet legacy, but instead like a showroom being remodeled while the old furniture was still in it. The first week of his leadership passed in whispers. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Office doors that had once been open were suddenly closed with locks I'd never seen before. People started avoiding the elevator after 4 p.m., just in case they got pulled into a conversation that ended with a cardboard box. Still, I stayed focused. Takeda's quarterly visit was just over a week away, and there was much to prepare. Mr. Takeda didn't appreciate last-minute changes or shallow gestures. He valued precision, context, and consistency. And for years, I'd made sure that every contract, visual aid, and face in the room spoke that language, even when they didn't know how. But then, on Thursday afternoon, a meeting invitation popped up in my inbox. No subject, just a time. 2:00 p.m. Conference Room D, sent by Ethan Cole's assistant. I arrived on time, even a little early, out of habit more than hope. Ethan was already there, seated at the head of a long table that looked recently polished. He didn't rise when I entered. He didn't even look up at first, just tapped a pen against a folder I recognized as my personnel file. "Mr. Whitaker," he said finally, eyes still scanning the papers. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was starting to pick up. "You've been with Harris Coal for, 18 years?" 19 this December, I answered. He nodded, flipping another page. No college degree, no formal certifications, no managerial title, no performance awards on record. Am I missing anything? I said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands like a man preparing to explain the math behind a difficult decision. I was brought in to modernize this company, Mr. Whitaker, to streamline operations, optimize roles, and implement a talent model that matches today's competitive environment. Every team must now justify its structure with clear output and measurable value. Still, I remained silent. Not because I had no defense, but because I knew from the tone of his voice that he had already made up his mind. I'm trying to understand, he continued, how your position fits into this new framework. You're assigned to international client relations, but there are no projects under your direct management, no legal or procurement credentials, no oversight duties, and frankly, nothing that I can see that aligns with our new operating model. I finally met his gaze. I work directly with Takeda Freight Group, I said calmly. I've been their liaison for over 17 years. Mr. Takeda won't attend a negotiation unless I'm in the room. Ethan raised an eyebrow, more amused than impressed. We'll review that account structure, he replied flatly. If they're still active, perhaps we can reassign oversight to someone from compliance or procurement. That's when I realized he didn't know. He didn't understand. He saw contracts, not relationships. He saw a name in a CRM, not a man who communicated through silence and precision and who would walk away the moment trust was broken. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. I left the meeting quietly, but with one haunting realization echoing in my chest. This man had just fired the only person in the company who could speak the language of our most vital client. The next morning, I arrived at my usual time, not because I was hopeful, but because I still had unfinished work. I spent the day reviewing notes from Mr. Takeda's last visit, fine-tuning the visual briefs, and confirming logistics. My badge still worked. My computer still logged in. The system hadn't caught up to the decision made behind a closed door. That evening, another message arrived. No subject line. Just another time. 4:30 p.m. Executive Suite. Ethan was waiting. Again. This time, he didn't bother with the file. Mr. Whitaker, he said, I've spoken with our HR and strategy teams, and after careful review, we've decided that your position no longer aligns with the company's future. I sat quietly, my hands folded, my back straight. You've been a loyal employee, no doubt, he continued, but we're building a professional workforce, credentialed, certified, scalable. Your background, while appreciated, does not reflect that direction. I didn't flinch, even as my throat tightened. And so, effective immediately, your employment is terminated. You'll receive 3 months severance. HR will handle the exit process. He paused, expecting something, maybe anger, maybe a plea, but I gave him neither. Instead, I stood slowly, adjusted the lapel of my worn blazer, and offered him the only parting words I could muster. I wish you luck with your next negotiations. He blinked, confused for a moment, then looked back down at his desk, already moving on. What he didn't know, what he still hadn't bothered to ask, was that the deal he'd been preparing to close the following week depended entirely on a conversation that could only happen in silence, and I was the only one who knew how to speak it. The official termination didn't hit me all at once. It arrived slowly, like fog creeping into familiar corners, the kind that settles in your bones before you even realize the room has grown cold. I packed what little I kept at my desk. A photo of my late wife tucked inside a simple wooden frame, a ceramic paperweight gifted to me by Mr. Takeda after our first closed deal, and a notebook filled with years of client nuances scribbled in the quiet shorthand only I understood. No one stopped me. No one asked why I was leaving early. In fact, no one seemed to notice at all, not the receptionist who used to greet me with a smile when I arrived before sunrise, not the junior execs who once relied on me to smooth over cultural missteps with our international accounts, and certainly not Ethan Cole, who was likely upstairs rehearsing lines for next week's flagship presentation, blissfully unaware that he had just severed the thread holding that deal together. But I didn't protest. I didn't shout, threaten, or send desperate emails. I knew this wasn't a battle I needed to fight with noise. I had learned long ago that real power rarely announces itself. It simply arrives when the time is right, quiet, and undeniable. That evening, after placing my few belongings in the trunk of my old Chevy, I sat in the driver's seat longer than I meant to, staring at the rearview mirror, not at my reflection, but at what lay behind me 19 years of service, erased with a single, soulless meeting. They didn't ask what I did or how I did it. They didn't care that I was the only one who could read Takeda's hand signs without needing to pause, rewind, or ask for clarification. They didn't care that trust, once broken, doesn't stitch itself back together with a LinkedIn search for certified interpreter. Still, I didn't spiral. I didn't wallow, perhaps because I'd been knocked down before by life, by illness, by years of being overlooked. But this time, something felt different. There was a steadiness beneath the ache, a calm forged not from acceptance, but from clarity. They had cut me loose, but they had no idea what they had lost, and even less understanding of what was coming. That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Carl Danner, my old mentor from the Regional Sign Language Institute, a man whose reputation spanned medical boards, government offices, and international negotiations. He'd once told me I was the only interpreter he'd met who could listen with his chest before his ears. When I explained what had happened, sparing no detail, he was quiet for a long time before saying, "Let me guess, they'll be calling me soon." I chuckled bitterly. "They might," I said, "but I needed you to know that their new leadership sees no use for people like us anymore." Carl responded with a weighty pause. Message received? The second call was to Elena Rousseau, a former colleague from an advanced cross-cultural negotiation course. She'd gone on to work with legal courts and international mediation panels, brilliant, loyal, and intuitive. I didn't ask for help. I simply told her I was no longer with Harris Cole. She didn't ask why. She knew. The third and final call was the most important, Samantha Oda, Mr. Takeda's personal liaison at the Osaka headquarters. We rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, but there was always an unspoken bond, forged through years of trust and shared silence. When she answered, her voice was cautious. "Are you all right?" she asked, as if sensing what I was about to say. "I'm not sick," I assured her gently, "but I won't be attending the meeting next week." There was a pause, a long one, and when she spoke again, it was softer. "They let you go." I didn't confirm, but I didn't need to. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered, and then she hung up. I knew what would happen next, not because I had orchestrated it, but because I had spent nearly 2 decades cultivating a kind of trust that can't be copied overnight. Samantha would tell Takeda not directly, and not in any formal briefing, but in a glance, in a shift of tone, in the slight change in her cadence that only he would notice. And when he did, when he asked where I was and why I wasn't there to greet him, as I had every quarter for the last 17 years, no interpreter for hire or shiny new executive would be able to fill that void. Because I hadn't just translated words. I had translated intent, context, and emotion, things no certificate could ever teach. I wasn't bitter. I didn't wish Harris, Cole harm, but I knew, with the kind of certainty that lives deep in the gut, that the silence they had dismissed would soon be the sound that haunted them. And so I waited, not for revenge, but for gravity to do its quiet, inevitable work. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my body, long trained by years of discipline and unspoken obligation, still believed there was a job waiting for me. I moved through the motions, made coffee the way I used to before long meetings, straightened a shirt I no longer needed to wear, and glanced at a calendar that still had Takeda review circled in red for Wednesday morning. Even after being dismissed, my mind hadn't yet let go of the habit of being needed. But this time, I wasn't heading into a boardroom. I was preparing for something quieter, something far more important. It wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. It was about truth, delivered not through press releases or confrontations, but through a series of carefully chosen conversations, the kind where tone meant more than content, and silence could carry a sharper edge than any accusation. The first person I reached out to was Samantha Oda, Takeda's personal liaison. We developed an unspoken rhythm over the years, never overly familiar, but deeply respectful, built on mutual understanding and a shared commitment to Mr. Takeda's vision. She answered my call on the second ring, her voice calm but alert, as if she had been expecting it. "I won't be attending Wednesday's meeting," I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause, not long, but deliberate, and then she asked, "Are you unwell?" "No," I replied, "not physically. I've been let go." Another silence followed, and though she didn't speak, I could feel the shift in her breath. She understood, perhaps even before I said it, what that meant. Samantha had spent years translating intent, and she knew how to read between lines that hadn't yet been spoken. "Thank you for letting me know," she said quietly, and then ended the call. No dramatic reactions, no drawn-out exchanges, but I knew she had already begun considering what would come next, not because I'd asked her to take action, but because people like her didn't need to be told when something was wrong. That was the point of the call, not to seek pity, not to stir trouble, but to plant the one seed that could not be ignored, the truth. The truth that I would not be in that room, the truth that no one else knew how to speak Mr. Takeda's language, the way I did, not just the gestures, but the nuance, the pauses, the cultural implications that required more than memorized signs. The truth that Harris Cole, under its gleaming new leadership, had dismissed not only a person, but a bridge, and they didn't even know it was burning beneath their feet. The second message I sent wasn't a call, but a short, handwritten letter delivered by courier, addressed directly to Mr. Takeda himself. It wasn't formal, it didn't include complaints or justifications, just a few simple lines in plain English and signed in both ink and a personal sign he had once taught me, the one that meant mutual respect. I didn't explain the full story. I didn't need to. The man had built a business empire by studying what wasn't said more carefully than what was. I trusted that when he read my note, he would remember not just the meetings we'd shared, but the trust we'd built slowly, intentionally, and without fanfare. Finally, I called Carl Danner, the same mentor I had spoken with the day before. This time, I asked him directly, "If they reach out, will you take the job?" There was no hesitation in his reply. "No," he said. "Not anymore. Not for them." I didn't press him for reasons. I didn't have to. The old guard of interpreters, the ones who had spent years bridging impossible cultural gaps without recognition or applause, understood something that Ethan Cole in his shiny boardroom hadn't grasped yet. Skill without soul was a dangerous kind of ignorance. And in 3 days, that ignorance was going to walk into a meeting, expecting cooperation, and meet a wall of silence instead. I spent the remainder of that afternoon in a quiet cafe near the waterfront, sipping lukewarm tea and watching the late autumn leaves drift across the sidewalk. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even nervous. In fact, for the first time since the diagnosis, I felt steady because I knew the truth had been sent, not shouted, not broadcast, but delivered to exactly the right ears in exactly the right way. I didn't need to storm back into the building or slam doors to make a statement. I'd already made one, in silence, and it would echo far louder than any formal complaint. Harris Cole believed they had removed a liability, but what they didn't realize was that they'd severed the only thread keeping their largest international client attached, and now that thread was quietly unraveling. Not because I said so, but because they never once asked who I really was. Wednesday arrived with a deceptive calm, no dark clouds, no nervous energy in the air, just a bright, ordinary morning that seemed to promise business as usual. But I knew better. The boardroom had been polished, the glasses filled, the slide decks rehearsed, and the smiles sharpened. What they didn't realize was that all their preparation was like dressing a stage for a performance they didn't understand and wouldn't survive. At precisely 9:00 a.m., a black sedan pulled up to the curb in front of Harris Cole's glass tower. Out stepped Mr. Kazuo Takeda, dignified as always in a charcoal suit, his steps quiet but purposeful, accompanied only by his trusted liaison, Samantha Oda. They were ushered in quickly by the receptionist, who, despite not knowing sign language, bowed slightly out of instinct, recognizing something in Mr. Takeda's calm that demanded deference. Inside the executive suite, Ethan Cole was already waiting, flanked by 2 assistants and a junior VP who had been practicing buzzwords for days. "Mr. Takeda," Ethan greeted, extending a hand he knew would not be taken. "We're honored to have you back. I trust your flight from Osaka was smooth." Mr. Takeda did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly to Samantha, who signed the message on his behalf. He nodded once, polite but reserved. Nothing in his face betrayed what he was thinking, but I could imagine the subtle change in his breathing, the kind of shift only someone like Samantha or I would notice. As they were led into the conference room, Ethan gestured toward the center seat, beaming like a man expecting applause. "We've prepared everything you'll need," to finalize the updated contract. Our interpreter should be here shortly to assist. It was at that moment, the precise second Ethan spoke the word interpreter, that the energy in the room shifted. Samantha stopped walking. She looked at Ethan, blinked once, and then asked softly, "Interpreter?" Ethan's confidence faltered just enough to register as a flicker. "Yes," he said. "We've arranged for a certified language specialist to support this meeting." Samantha did not nod. She did not move. She simply replied, "And Mr. Whitaker?" Ethan hesitated. "Mr. Whitaker is no longer with the company. He paused, searching for a spin. "We're transitioning into a more modern operations model and reevaluating team structures for efficiency." That's when the silence settled, not the kind born of awkwardness, but the kind that precedes a storm. Samantha signed something quickly to Mr. Takeda. He turned toward Ethan with the same steady gaze he had offered at the beginning, but now there was weight behind it. He raised one hand and moved his fingers, a single, simple phrase that I knew all too well. It meant, "We will wait, but not for long." Panic doesn't always come in screams. Sometimes it starts in the eyes, a flicker of realization that spreads like a crack through glass. Ethan turned to his assistant. "Get someone in here," he whispered. "Anyone. Call Danner. Call Rousseau. Call every agency in the tri-state area." His assistant's expression tightened. "Sir, we've already tried." Mr. Danner declined. "Miss Rousseau isn't available. The agencies say no one is free on such short notice." Ethan's voice lowered to a growl. "They all declined? Why?" She hesitated, then answered, "Because they were informed, discreetly, about how Mr. Whitaker's dismissal was handled. And some, like Mr. Danner, said they won't represent companies that undervalue internal interpreters." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to will the room into behaving. "Then bring in someone from legal," he snapped. "Or HR, anyone who's ever watched a YouTube tutorial." But it was already too late. Inside the boardroom, Mr. Takeda sat at the table, unmoving. Samantha stood beside him, arms folded, refusing to interpret for the company that had just severed its only reliable line of communication. Ethan stepped back into the room, cheeks flushed and hands stiff. "We're just waiting on one more individual," he said through a forced smile. Mr. Takeda signed again. Samantha translated with clinical precision. "We will wait, but we will not stay long." In that moment, the polished veneer cracked. Ethan looked around the room, hoping someone would intervene, hoping some backup plan he hadn't made would suddenly appear. But no one moved, because there was no one left to fix what he had broken. And then, just as the air seemed too thick to breathe, the door opened. I stepped inside, not with triumph, but with purpose. I wore no badge, carried no briefcase, and answered to no title. I made no dramatic entrance. I simply walked to the head of the table and looked Mr. Takeda in the eye. He saw me, and for the first time that morning, his shoulders relaxed. Without waiting for permission, I began to sign. Slowly, clearly, deliberately. I didn't just interpret the agenda. I translated the damage, the betrayal, the dissonance between what had once been a partnership of equals and what now felt like a one-sided performance. Mr. Takeda listened, not just with his eyes, but with the full attention of someone who understands when trust has been fractured. After several long minutes, he responded. I nodded, signed back, and then turned to Samantha, who remained still, her expression unreadable. Then, with composure honed over years of silence, she translated aloud, "We will proceed with signing this contract, but this will be our last meeting under current leadership." The words landed with a weight no volume could enhance. Ethan didn't reply. He only blinked, nodded, and reached for the pen. Papers were signed, hands were half-heartedly shaken, and I slipped out of the room before anyone thought to stop me. By that afternoon, champagne was opened in the executive lounge. Ethan gave a speech about resilience, adaptability, and leadership under pressure. Emails were drafted praising the team's commitment. From the outside, it looked like a success. But just before closing hours, an email arrived in legal's inbox. Subject: termination of future engagement from Trident Group, legal affairs status, final and non-negotiable. The message was brief, courteous, and fatal. Trident would honor the existing contract, but all future projects, expansions, and collaborations with Harris Cole were officially suspended. No further discussions would be entertained. Attached to the message was a video file labeled "Internal Use Only." It was silent footage from the boardroom's security camera, showing me standing at the table, signing to Mr. Takeda, framed by two executives who couldn't understand a single thing I was saying. Later, I was told the video had been reviewed by the entire board, and while none of them understood the language, they understood what mattered: that Ethan had dismissed not just an employee, but the one person who had made trust possible. And by the time he realized what he had lost, there was nothing left to save. By Thursday morning, the ripples had become waves. Whispers floated between departments like pollen in spring, harmless on their own, but together, they carried something heavy in the air: recognition. Something had gone wrong, and the people who had smiled the widest just 2 days ago now moved with shoulders tight and eyes lowered, as if they could feel the company holding its breath. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole, once so precise in his posture and tone, had begun to retreat behind glass walls and curt replies. He no longer strolled through the open spaces with casual authority or called impromptu syncs to impress with jargon and pivot slides. Instead, he remained locked in his office, pacing the same four corners, speaking in clipped bursts on secure calls, and, according to someone in legal, refusing lunch for the second day straight, a detail small enough to overlook, but telling for a man who once performed confidence like it was a product launch. The official notice from Trident had landed like a silent grenade. There had been no public scandal, no headlines, no crisis team dispatched. But within the stillness came damage that couldn't be undone. Their largest international client had cut them off, not with fire and fury, but with precision and silence. The language of rejection was calm and deadly, and Ethan knew it. Still, what unraveled him wasn't the loss of the partnership alone, it was the surveillance footage. That single, soundless clip from the boardroom camera passed along to senior leadership showed me badgeless, jobless, and calm standing at the head of the table while Ethan sat off to the side, helpless and unreadable. The others didn't need to understand the signs to understand the message. They saw who had controlled the room, and they saw who hadn't. What followed wasn't an explosion, but a disintegration. Slowly, Ethan began trying to erase me not from memory, but from reputation. He instructed his assistant to gather every document, note, and internal record with my name on it. He personally revised the HR files, changing my exit reason from administrative restructuring to violation of conduct standards. A subtle shift, buried in code only a few would notice, but enough to stain. He contacted Glenn Faulkner, a crisis PR strategist known for cleaning up after executive blunders and political stumbles. I had heard of Glenn before: discreet, expensive, and thoroughly efficient at reshaping narratives behind closed doors. Ethan asked him to investigate me, my past roles, my contacts, even potential offers. Glenn didn't ask why. Men like him knew that when someone said, "contain this," they meant destroy it before it bloomed. Within 48 hours, subtle calls were placed to firms I'd once contracted with. References were questioned. My credentials were whispered about with carefully measured skepticism, not accusations, just doubt. And in a hiring climate driven by risk aversion, doubt can be a scalpel more effective than truth. One agency in Boston quietly removed me from consideration. A recruiter in Seattle, who'd previously reached out with interest, went dark after a red flag email labeled "internal disruption concerns" was forwarded anonymously to their review board. Then, a letter from Harris, Cole's legal department, arrived in my mailbox, thinly veiled as a formality, accusing me of breaching confidentiality. It carried no substance, no actual threat, but it was enough to serve as warning. Stay quiet, stay gone. It was a scare tactic, a cheap one. And yet, I didn't respond. I didn't write back, hire, counsel, or attempt to clear my name, because I knew that somewhere far more important, the truth had already settled in the mind of a man who had signed a contract not with ink, but with trust. I didn't need to defend myself in places that no longer valued what I brought. But Ethan couldn't let it go, because it wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. He had been humiliated, not by a rival, but by someone he hadn't even bothered to see. And that made the wound deeper, the failure sharper. because it meant he had misjudged the very system he claimed to control. His downfall didn't come with a bang. It arrived by courier. A plain envelope, no return address, marked confidential. Inside was a single page typed, formal, signed by Kazuo Takeda himself. Mr. Cole, we are aware of your coordinated effort to interfere with Mr. Whitaker's professional reputation. This behavior is unethical and beneath the standards of leadership. Let this letter serve as formal notice. Any further contact, misinformation, or obstruction related to Mr. Whitaker's career will result in immediate legal action. Govern yourself accordingly. The note wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive, and according to those who were in the room when he read it, Ethan went pale and silent, standing by his window for almost an hour without speaking. His assistant, unsure whether to interrupt, stood in the doorway holding another folder until he finally turned, took it from her without a word, and returned to his desk like a man who had seen something crack from the inside. Over the next few days, the damage continued to bloom. 2 additional clients, smaller but still meaningful, reached out to delay negotiations. One European supplier canceled their Q3 review entirely, citing concerns around executive transparency. Internally, the board began requesting audit trails. HR leadership flagged the altered files. Glenn Faulkner, sensing liability, stopped taking Ethan's calls altogether. And still, I said nothing. I gave no interviews. I filed no complaints. I didn't need to. Because truth, when planted carefully, doesn't need to shout to be heard. It takes root, silently, in the rooms where decisions are made. And Ethan, for all his degrees, consultants, and confidence, had finally come to understand the cost of underestimating someone who had once spoken only in silence and had learned how to be heard without ever raising a voice. The rain had started mid-afternoon, steady, not urgent, tapping against the cafe window where I sat with a cup of lukewarm tea in front of me and the weight of everything that had happened resting quietly on my shoulders. I hadn't turned my phone on in 2 days, not out of fear, but because I no longer needed to chase updates or brace for impact. The storm, if it could even be called that, had already passed, not in lightning bolts or headlines, but in subtle shifts and silent reckonings. I didn't expect anything more. I had spoken when it mattered, and then I had stepped back not to disappear, but to let truth echo in the rooms where I'd once been ignored. So when the cafe hostess approached with a sealed envelope in her hand and asked, "Are you Mr. Whitaker?" I was caught off guard. I nodded, and she passed it to me with the same care you might use when handing someone a folded flag. The envelope was thick, unbranded, and elegant in its simplicity. Inside was a single sheet of ivory paper, handwritten in clear, deliberate strokes. Mr. Whitaker, your loyalty, discretion, and clarity of purpose have never gone unnoticed. You stood not for titles, but for trust, and in doing so, you became the foundation of something we are now ready to build upon. We would be honored if you accepted the position of Director of Strategic Inclusion and Cross-Cultural Integrity at Takeda Group. The role is yours, if you choose it. Respectfully, Kazuo Takeda. There was no salary listed, no mention of benefits or start date, no corporate jargon to dull the edges, just the kind of offer only a man like Takeda would extend, rooted in principle, not transaction. I sat there for a long moment, letting the words settle not just in my mind, but in my chest, where the bruises from what had been lost still lived. I thought back to my last day at Harris Cole, walking out of that revolving door with no applause, no farewell, and no recognition, just a quiet exit from a place that had grown blind to the value of what it could not quantify. And now, here I was, invited not to return to the past, but to shape the future, not because I had fought back loudly, but because I had never stopped listening, never stopped caring, even after they had stopped seeing me. A week later, I entered the same kind of conference room where I had once been dismissed, only this time, I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't background noise or a silent presence expected to translate and vanish. I stood at the front, not as an interpreter, but as a keynote speaker, leading a leadership seminar on trust, integrity, and the invisible power of human understanding. In attendance were several department heads from Harris's Cole, now nervously rebranded as Cole Global Logistics, seated with folded arms and stiff collars. Their eyes tracked me carefully, waiting to see if I would strike back, shame them, name names, but I didn't. I wasn't there to retaliate. I was there to teach. I began simply, "Let me tell you about the cost of not listening." What followed wasn't a lecture, but a story about the years spent building bridges between cultures, about the damage that occurs when leadership is reduced to credentials without conscience, and about the quiet dignity of those who carry companies forward even when no one's watching. Afterward, one of the senior executives approached me. He looked older than I remembered, more worn. "How did you stay so calm through all of it?" he asked, voice low. I smiled, not with pride, but with clarity. "I didn't stay calm," I said. "I stayed focused." Word of my return traveled quietly but firmly. No press release announced it. No LinkedIn post celebrated it. But within boardrooms and HR departments, something began to shift, not dramatically, but steadily. My name, once flagged and forgotten, was now cited as a case study in ethical failure and strategic blindness. Not because I had sued, not because I had shouted, but because I had remained. And in the end, Ethan Cole, once the rising star of data-driven leadership, resigned quietly, his NDA signed, his title erased from the firm's website within days. No legacy left, no plaque hung. Just a cautionary tale passed from executive to executive over dinner tables and closed-door meetings. Don't ignore the quiet ones, they might be the foundation you're standing on. Call to action, CTA. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like your value disappeared with your title, this story is for you. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't rage. It's rising. And if this story spoke to something inside you, a truth you've lived, or a silence you've survived, leave a comment below. We see you, we hear you, and your story matters. CAD, subscribe for more real stories of justice, dignity, and comeback.